I'm very excited about our next talk, which is from Dr. Martha Clare Morris from Rush University. Dr. Morris is the director of the Rush Institute for Healthy Aging, and she's also director of the Mind Center. Different mind, but we'll gladly take her here at UCI if we can talk later. She's director of the Mind Center for Brain Health and director of and professor of the section on nutrition and nutritional epidemiology in the Department of Internal Medicine at Rush. She's also now assistant provost of community research. She has really been a pioneer in studying nutrition as it relates to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. She's done really fantastic work combining both epidemiology and things like neuropathology to really get at how diet and dietary patterns impact risk for disease. And she is now the PI of an extremely important clinical trial of more than 600 people who are at risk to develop dementia because of their weight and dietary habits, to see if the Mind diet, which she is the author of, can reduce risk for developing dementia. So, Dr. Morris, thank you.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's so lovely to be here. It's just a beautiful area of the world, and I'm also very honored to be among such a distinguished group of speakers. So thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to talk today about, first of all, I'll identify nutrients, foods, and diet patterns that are important to brain health. And this will allow me to go into some of the design issues that are the basis for my talk, rather than outcomes, as it says in your agenda. And this will apply specifically to the evidence in vitamin supplement trials, which you'll see have been overall very negative. And then I'll move into describing diet intervention trials. There haven't been many, and I'll try and focus on some of the design strategies that we've put into our Mind Diet trial to have a successful trial. So very basically, we know a lot about predictors of Alzheimer's disease. Older age, low education, the ApoE4 allele, cardiovascular risk factors, and obesity are some of the primary predictors, risk factors of Alzheimer's. And then there's a number of protective factors that have been identified: exercise, cognitive activity, social participation, and potentially some drugs. And dietary factors contribute to both. There are some dietary factors that are risk factors and others that can prevent Alzheimer's. So this slide summarizes what we know in the field today of diet and the prevention of Alzheimer's disease, or the flip side, keeping a healthy brain. So I would say, and this is just my opinion, that there's strong evidence for dietary tocopherols, also known as vitamin E, DHA, one of the omega-3 fatty acids, folate, a B vitamin, and a composition of diet that is higher in the unsaturated and lower in the saturated fats. And I have listed on this slide the primary food sources for each one of these dietary components. Then there's moderate evidence, or it's pretty limited but promising, for carotenoids, in particular lutein, and flavonoids, vitamin D, trans fats, monounsaturated fat, and polyphenols. So let's start with the antioxidant nutrients, and I've lumped into this category vitamins E, C, the carotenoids, and polyphenols. This first graph is from our Chicago Health and Aging Project that included almost 4,000 people living in the community, and we followed them over time. This particular study followed them for up to 6 years. And we have their cognitive status on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have time on study. Each one of these lines are their dietary intake of vitamin E. So this is strictly from food sources. And we see a very linear association. This pink bar represents people in the lowest quintile of vitamin E intake from food. They have the fastest rate of cognitive decline. And with each successive quintile of intake, we have significantly slower decline. We also found that people, when we looked at, in this population of the CHAP study, who developed Alzheimer's disease over time, here we have a relative risk of 1, this horizontal bar, and these are quintiles of intake down here of vitamin E, again, strictly from foods. And we find that people in the highest quintile of intake compared to the lowest had a 60% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So this slide presents the prospective epidemiological studies that have looked at different antioxidants, again, strictly in diet. And what I want you to take home from this slide, for each antioxidant nutrient, vitamin E, you can see this little plus sign in almost every single study indicates that they saw a protective association. The results for vitamin C, there's only a few plus signs. You can see that it's not very strong at all. Beta-carotene, also not very convincing. And flavonoids, just way too few studies that have looked at this bioactive component in the diet, but they tend to be positive. So now this slide shows the prospective studies, and the highlighted in green studies are actually randomized clinical trials of supplements. But you can see that both the epidemiological studies and the clinical trials agree that there's no association between taking the supplements and risk of cognitive decline or developing Alzheimer's. As that's so for vitamin C as well. Beta-carotene, there is one trial that demonstrated a benefit over a very long follow-up. So in both cases, we see that vitamin supplements haven't been effective in lowering risk of disease. Now, the design issue 1 that I want to focus on is that all of these trials have ignored a very basic rule in nutritional and physiological function. And this is from a standard text. It's a very basic concept in nutrition. We have physiological function here on the y-axis, so death at the bottom here and up to the optimum physiological function. And then we have on the x-axis the level of nutrient intake or the nutrient status. And you can see that it's not a linear association, that there is a wide range of moderate intake that results in optimum functioning. And if you go lower or higher, you can have suboptimal physical functioning. So let's apply that concept now to some of those negative trials that I showed you on that previous slide. This is one of the negative trials. Oops, excuse me. The Women's Health Study. They randomized women to 600 international units of alpha-tocopherol. The RDA for vitamin A or vitamin E or alpha-tocopherol is around 22 international units. So you can see how much larger that amount that they were given is. They were followed for almost 10 years, and the outcome was cognitive change. Overall, this is a null trial. There was no overall effect. In post hoc analyses, however, they found that people whose baseline dietary intake was very low, 6.1 milligrams per day, they had a significant benefit from the vitamin E supplement, whereas people who were above that level had no effect. So let me show you through this diagram what may be going on here. People who are randomized in the clinical trials, they're generally people who are very interested in their health. They're healthy behavior-seeking people, and in general, they have good health and they probably have pretty healthy diets. So they're probably not marginal or deficient in a vitamin or a nutritional individual nutrient. So they're already starting at an optimal level for functioning for that nutrient. So giving a supplement really doesn't give any additional benefit. So what you observe is no effect. So what these vitamin supplement trials really need to do in the prevention area is to target people who have marginal status and then supplement. And then you're much more likely to observe an effect if indeed there is an effect of that nutrient on the brain. Another issue might be the form of the nutrient. So they take a synthetic biochemical consistency of a nutrient and they put it into a supplement. And it might not represent what we get in foods. So the alpha tocopherol is just one form of vitamin E. There's also other forms, and in fact, in the US, the primary food source of tocopherols is gamma tocopherol, not alpha. We did an analysis in our CHAP study, our large community study. We looked at, this was over 6 years, looking at their cognitive change. We found that total tocopherol intake was significantly associated with slower decline, as was alpha tocopherol, as was gamma tocopherol. And they come from somewhat different food sources. So we next looked at our Memory and Aging Project, which is another community study at Rush, and this has 1,200 Chicago residents of retirement communities. Actually, it's always increasing because it's an ongoing study. But what's interesting about these studies is that people agree to donate their brains when they die. So we can look at diet intake, and then we can follow them over the course of aging, and then we can look at what goes on in their brain. And we analyzed the brains for the different tocopherol forms. And what we found was these are tertiles of alpha tocopherol levels in the brain, and we looked at amyloid load and we looked at tangle severity. And alpha tocopherol levels in the brain were not associated with either Alzheimer pathology. However, what we found for gamma tocopherol levels in the brain was that there was a significant association, a lowering of both amyloid load and tangle severity. So perhaps the clinical trials had the wrong form of vitamin E. We looked at presynaptic protein levels. So that would be all of the proteins involved in the synaptic transmission. And what we found here is that alpha tocopherol seemed to play a role in the synaptic proteins, because we can see that increased levels of alpha tocopherol were associated with increased levels of various presynaptic proteins, but gamma tocopherol was not. So moving on to a different dietary component, the omega-3 fatty acids. And the three primary forms are alpha-linolenic acid, and then when we consume this from plants, we can desaturate and elongate these internally, or we can get them from fish or other marine organisms. And you've all probably heard of EPA and DHA. These are the N3 fatty acids from seafood. So alpha-linolenic acid is found in a variety of plant sources, but what started all of the interest in it was that it's so very high in mother's milk. And our first formulas did not have omega-3 fatty acids in them, so it was of intense interest. This started a lot of research, primarily in animal models, but eventually winding up in human studies as well, and found that the brain, which is 50 to 60% lipid material, one of the primary lipids is DHA. And DHA is found in the most metabolically active areas of the brain and have been found to be very important for just the structural and functional maintenance of the neurons, for neurotransmission and membrane fluidity, among other things. This turned the attention of the animal world to, okay, omega-3s and DHA is important for neurocognitive development. What about in the aging brain? And what they found was that DHA was actually very important for protecting the brain and increased hippocampal nerve growth, the fluidity of the synaptic membranes, increasing antioxidant enzymes, and decreasing oxidation, inflammation, and amyloid burden. So we looked at this in our Chicago Health and Aging project, and we looked at fish consumption compared to those who rarely ate fish. Those who consumed just one seafood meal a week had a 60% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Those who consumed 2 or more servings per week, they had no additional benefit. It was still 60%. So this is a slide of the prospective studies that have looked at omega-3 fatty acids or fish. So I have here in these final 2 columns the exposure being looking at omega-3s or fish consumption, and the yellow arrows indicating that there was slower decline in cognitive abilities over time, and you can see that there is a large number of studies that demonstrated this. These are the studies that looked at fish or seafood consumption and risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Here are the different studies. This is no association, this yellow bar. And we see that all of the studies had risks that were in the protective direction. All were statistically significant, except for the study that included seafood consumption of 1 meal per week in their comparison category. So they all are demonstrating that just 1 seafood meal a week is the level of protective benefit. So let's look at the fish oil trials then that looked at DHA or DHA plus EPA and giving them very high levels and paying no attention to who they've randomized into the trial. So imagine if nearly all of the participants are consuming at least 1 seafood meal a week, do you expect to see any benefit if the level is much lower? But in addition, all of the trials allowed their participants, whether they were on placebo or not, or on the DHA, to consume up to 3 seafood meals a week. So let's move on to dietary fats. I'll be brief on this. Dietary fats, and we're talking about the composition. So having high unsaturated to low saturated fats in your diet leads to a favorable lipid profile and has been shown in animal models to be very effective for the brain. So a high saturated fat cholesterol diet has been associated with A beta deposition, impaired memory, neuroinflammation, and impairment of the blood-brain barrier, among other things. These are all the studies that have looked at, prospective studies that have looked at fats and fat composition in relation to cognitive decline. You can see that the most consistent findings are for high saturated fat being associated with increased cognitive decline. The B vitamins. So what has been understood about the B vitamins is that it's deficiencies in these B vitamins that are the issue. And when there's deficiencies in B12, there is a noted neurologic syndrome that includes dementia in some cases. But deficiencies in either vitamin B12 or folate will increase homocysteine. So there's a lot that we don't understand of their importance to the brain, and there's many problems in studying them epidemiologically because Some countries fortify their food supply with folic acid, whereas others don't. So the findings are all over the place. When we look, though, at studies of Alzheimer's disease and the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, you can see that there's a really consistent finding of low or marginal levels of folate being associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So these downward arrows indicate that having adequate status of folate decreases risk of developing AD. Now, the clinical trials I show here, I want you to take note that there were 2 clinical trials that targeted people with low folate status. And it was those individuals, they randomized to treatments, one for 8 weeks, one for 3 years. The ones that targeted people with suboptimal folate status both showed significant results in slowing cognitive decline. So those are some very rare, well-designed clinical trials in the nutritional field. So let's move on to food groups. I find it extraordinarily interesting that the only studies that looked at vegetables and fruits separately in relation to cognitive decline or developing mild cognitive impairment, they didn't find association with fruits, but they did with vegetables, which is interesting because you think people who eat vegetables also eat fruits. But there have been, and it started with animal models, and especially a laboratory at Tufts that looked at many different berries in relation to cognition, memory, and what goes on in the brain. And berries is a very different category of fruit that has been demonstrated to be protective of the brain. And there's been the Nurses' Health Study and our Chicago Health and Aging Project, and now the Memory and Aging Project, all show that berry consumption slows cognitive decline. Now, here's our data from the Chicago Health and Aging Project linking vegetable consumption to cognitive decline over time. So here's the cognitive scores on the y-axis and time on study on the x-axis. And these colored lines are increasing levels of vegetable intake. So these are the top 2 quintiles, and that's roughly about 2 vegetable servings per day or more, showing the slowest rate of cognitive decline. In this graph, I just was trying to demonstrate, we looked at different types of vegetables, cruciferous, green leafy, yellow vegetables, among them legumes. And these orange bars show you the strength of the relation. And you can see that leafy greens, the more leafy greens a person consumed in their diets, the slower the rate of cognitive decline. That was not observed as being as strong for other types of vegetables. The Nurses' Health Study and another Dutch study found a similar finding. So in the Memory and Aging Project, we targeted those leafy greens, and we looked at leafy green consumption, and we found a whopping association. So these are people consuming 1 or more leafy greens per day versus those who rarely consume leafy greens. And this difference in the rate of cognitive decline was the equivalent of being 11 years younger in age. So it's a very strong association. So foods are never consumed just in isolation. We eat them in patterns. So I wanted to show you the epidemiology studies looking at diet patterns. Now, everybody has in their head the idea that the Mediterranean diet is definitely associated with slower cognitive decline. I list here all the studies that have, prospective studies that have looked at the Mediterranean diet. What you can see is there was a lot of studies that have dashes, meaning it's a negative finding. And I've highlighted in yellow those studies that actually found a protective association, some looking at cognitive decline, others dementia. Now, there is a difference between the gold highlighted studies and the ones that aren't gold highlighted. There's been an unfortunate coding of diet data in the field where they simply go to a population and they say if they're over the median, they get a good score. If they're below the median, they get a bad score, which has no relevance to what the Mediterranean diet is. So if I went to a Southwest population and almost nobody ate leafy green vegetables, and I gave it that kind of score, that does not compare. So say the median is 1 serving of green leafies a day or vegetables a day. The Greek population ate 4 or more servings per day of leafy greens, vegetables. So the metrics don't correlate at all with the Mediterranean diet. So these highlighted studies are the ones that actually use the Mediterranean diet as the metric. So these are some other studies that looked at other diets. We have the Nordic diet pattern that showed slower cognitive decline. The DASH study, DASH diet has had variable findings. We found a significant decline, slower decline, as well as significant lower risk of dementia. We have the Westernized diet showing increased cognitive decline, and a low-carb diet, no effect or no association. So you can see there's not been that many studies looking at diet patterns, but the Mediterranean diet is the one that people associate with slower decline. So there have been some secondary analyses in some diet intervention trials. Let's look at the Predimed study. The Predimed study was done among 7,000 Spaniards, and they randomized them to either consuming a Mediterranean diet, some supplemented with olive oil, some with nuts, or a low-fat diet. And there was a sub-study of just 500 people where they administered cognitive tests. And they administered these about almost 7 years after the trial started. And what they found was that both the Mediterranean plus olive oil or the Mediterranean plus mixed nut groups had significantly higher scores at the end of the trial. This is the MMSE, and also a clock drawing test. So this was a very promising result that I think was instrumental in changing the attitude of the research community that maybe diet was something that was going to protect against Alzheimer's disease and help to have a healthy brain with age. The supplement trials really did a number on that attitude. Very few in the field of Alzheimer's disease thought diet had anything to do with the brain once these trials came out negative. So another trial, also as a secondary outcome, this one was a much smaller trial, only 124 people. These were all hypertensive, overweight adults, and they tended to be younger than what we usually study in Alzheimer's disease. The mean age was 52. And they had 3 groups. They had the DASH diet, which is a diet to lower blood pressure and prevent hypertension. They had the DASH diet plus weight management, which was really aerobic exercise, 30 minutes 3 times per week. And then they had a usual care group. And they administered 8 tests pre and post the intervention. And the intervention was just 4 months long, so it was pretty short. But what they found was, this is the memory test, and this is a test of psychomotor speed. They found that the DASH diet had significantly better scores than the DASH plus weight management, that is, and then the DASH alone had intermediate, and then the control group had the lowest. And then both the intervention groups had better cognitive speed. So these were very promising results from secondary trials. So we decided it was time to have a diet intervention trial designed to look at the brain. There had never been one done before. And that was really how the Mind Diet even got created. Because when we sat down to design this trial, we had to decide what the diet was going to be. And we thought, well, the DASH diet looks promising, the Mediterranean looks promising, but we can't ignore everything we've studied and know about diet in the brain. So we went through item by item on the DASH and Mediterranean diets, and we looked at that dietary component, and we modified it based on the scientific evidence on nutrition and the brain. So I'll highlight some differences. So I showed you all that data on the green leafy vegetables. Neither the DASH nor the Mediterranean diets specify what type of vegetable, and they also specify 4 or more servings per day. So we knew from the data that it was 2 or more vegetable servings a day that was the pivotal level of benefit, and that one of those servings should be a leafy green, because that is the vegetable with the strongest effect. So we modified it to 2 or more servings per day, one of which should be a leafy green. We have no fruit specification in the diet. Both the Mediterranean and DASH diets are 3 to 4 servings per day of fruits, but we do specify berries, 2 to 5 servings per week. So we went through that item by item. We have 15 components, and we got funded to do the trial. And the trial, before we did that, we looked at whether or not the scoring that we did was actually associated with any kind of outcome in our epidemiological studies. So we looked at the Memory and Aging Project of almost 1,000 people, up to 10 years of follow-up. And here's people on the highest Mind Diet score. This is highest tertile. They had the slowest cognitive decline. People who were intermediate on the score also had significantly slower cognitive decline than those in the lowest. When we compared the Mind Diet findings to the Mediterranean diet score and the DASH diet scores, we found that the Mind Diet score had almost double the estimates of effect of slowing cognitive decline than either of the 2 diets. Looking at incident Alzheimer's disease, we found that the Mind Diet score and the Mediterranean had similar. The highest tertiles were associated with a 53% reduction in risk of Alzheimer's, but even the intermediate scores for the mind had a 35% reduction in Alzheimer's risk. So here we go to the trial. Our trial is testing the effects of the Mind Diet on cognitive decline. And we're also looking at brain changes and blood biomarkers for dementia, inflammation, and oxidation. And we're also looking at cardiovascular conditions. There's 3 centers, Rush and the Harvard School of Public Health are 2 clinical centers, and then we have a data coordinating center at Harvard. And we have the imaging and biochemical laboratories that are in common. The study is funded by the National Institute on Aging, and we have food donations from a number of growers in the U.S. to provide olive oil, blueberries, and nuts. So here's our design. We are having a mild weight loss component to both the control and the intervention groups. This is to maintain compliance and motivation in both groups. It's just 250 calories per day that we're asking them to reduce from whatever level they are currently at. And here are all the Mind Diet items, and I told you we hand out olive oil and blueberries and nuts. The trial is 65 to 84 years of age, the participants. They don't have cognitive impairment, but they're overweight at least and have a suboptimal diet. We are testing the effects in 300 of the individuals. We look at their pre-post brain images. And we're also looking at cardiovascular disease conditions. And then we're going to be looking at mediators of the effect. Here I list all the biochemical mediators that we're looking at. And we're also targeting depression and psychological distress. So I want to spend the remaining time to talk about, we're a year and 3 months into the study for our first randomized participants. And we have excellent compliance. We also have less than 0.3% dropping out of the trial. We have a greater than 95% compliance in coming in for assessments and meeting with their dietitians. So we have very successful implementation of the trial thus far. I would say that we looked very hard for ways to design the trial to make this happen this way. And it occurred to us when we did a literature review that it was in person, whether it be personal, whether it be in person or by phone, contact with a case manager. We have dietitians in our trial, plus people that are not trained that way, but they meet frequently with participants on an individual basis. We provide recipes, we give cooking demonstrations, we have online and app tools for tracking, although this is an older population and I must say very few actually use them. We have family and friends included if they like to the sessions. And we haven't used them yet, but we have the option of home visits. So our trial, we've designed it to have equal intensity between the two groups. They both see their dietitian an equal number of times. We try to make every intervention with them as similar as possible. So I think I discussed all those. When I come to speak at these engagements, people always want to know what my website is, where they can go look up materials on the MIND diet and everything that I presented in the talk. There is no such thing. And there is a good reason. We will set up something like that once the trial is completed. We don't want to make it easy for our participants to go up on the website and people in the control group seeing just exactly what they should do. I do have a book out which will describe everything I talked about today and also describes these diets. That was in progress before we got funding to do the trial. So I let people know that they do have a source. So thank you very much.
Before lunch, which everyone's wondering what's for lunch now. Before lunch, we have time for a few questions. Dr. Sajadi in the back.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. I had a question about the green vegetable component, about whether there is a difference between cooked versus non-cooked, because we hear all of the stories about that. Thank you.
So whether there's a difference between cooked and non-cooked. So that's a complex question. There's no data to show whether cooked versus non-cooked is linked to Alzheimer's disease. But we do know about what happens to the food when it's cooked or non-cooked. And I can tell you that it depends on the nutrient. So the water-soluble vitamins, vitamin C, folate, are destroyed when they're cooked. Whereas the fat-soluble nutrients like vitamin E, lutein from green leafy vegetables, those are fat-soluble. They tend to concentrate when you cook them. So I recommend to people, first of all, go with what you like. If you like spinach only raw, by all means, eat spinach raw. But I just tell people it's probably a good idea to do a mixture of both.
Hi, nice talk. marketing efforts have promoted coconut oil and MCTs, or medium chain triglycerides in particular, as being able to cross the blood-brain barrier, decrease cerebral inflammation. Is this all hype, or are there any studies that support that?
There are no scientific publications to support those theories. There is a very important clinical trial that's ongoing. It's still recruiting, actually, in people with mild cognitive impairment called BEAT-AD. It's on the clinical trials website. This trial will be giving a ketogenic diet to people with MCI, and it's only a 4-month intervention, so they'll be looking at biochemical markers and changes. They'll also be looking at cognition, but that's not their main outcome. So it was based on anecdotal information linked to some plausible biochemical reasons why the ketogenic diet would be helpful in Alzheimer's disease. But I must emphasize that for a healthy individual, those ketogenic diets have some unfavorable effects on health. So I don't think it's a good idea for people to go on a ketogenic diet thinking they're going to prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Hi, I was wondering if anyone looked at how the intermittent fasting diets affect cognitive decline, like 4-3 or 5-2?
There's so much work we have to do in this area. There isn't any data to support whether or not that would be helpful for Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, so I have a question about the prospective studies that you mentioned on green leafy vegetables. How well has socioeconomic status or socioeconomic position been controlled in a lot of these trials? Because, as you know, price of food can be an issue for those with low SES, and also the strong relationship between education and dementia.
All of the studies control for education or have some form of socioeconomic status measure, but as you know, they're imperfect. What's interesting, in our Chicago Health and Aging project, the leafy greens were primarily consumed by our African Americans, which represented 60% of our population, because they typically consume collards and greens. That was one of their favorite food items. And so that qualifies as a leafy green. So it's not as simple as you think that, vegetables, of course, are going to be associated with higher socioeconomic status.
Last one.
For over a year now, I've been buying packages of dried beans that contain 12 different varieties. Do you select and recommend certain varieties, or do you think they're all maybe equally beneficial?
So you said beans?
Beans.
Uh-huh. We have no data to guide us. If you look at the nutritional content of different varieties of beans, it's not huge, the differences across varieties, but there's no data to guide particular beans in relation to brain health.